Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video for the channel on a new mod I'm covering, Ice and Fire Total War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War Attila that overhauls it and bases it in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the A Song of Ice and Fire books. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts, as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because this mod chooses to discard the visual style of the show, it means that a lot of the units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see and which is something we'll touch on later down the line. This video will be a first in the new series where I break down the factions of Westeros and Essos and their available units, comparing them to their inspirations in the books and real life before looking at how historically authentic the units' arms and armour are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in a very early alpha. However, even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. For today's video, the faction I'm going to be covering is Dorne, specifically the only house currently available in the Dornish roster, House Martell. Dorne is the southernmost region of Westeros and is quite culturally different to the rest of the continent, being somewhat more progressive compared to the traditionally medieval neighbours. A land of deserts, mountains and coast, it's one of the less populated regions of the realm. It was able to resist being conquered by the Targaryens and their dragons for centuries, before joining the Seven Kingdoms due to marriage rather than war. Looking at House Martell, they're the great house of the region, based in a castle called Sunspear, the house being unique in that all of its leaders use the title Prince or Princess due to their history of independence, and that women often lead the house and by extension Dorne, something very rarely seen elsewhere in Westeros. In terms of historical influences for Dorne and House Martell, George R.R. Martin has been very open, saying that the region is based on the Iberian Peninsula during its control by Arabs and the subsequent Reconquista, as well as the general Middle East or the Middle Ages, something that will become very apparent when you look at the units that the faction fields. Turning to the units, we'll begin by looking at its generals, each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which is normally a regular unit in the roster as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unit. That unique general unit for House Martell and Dorne is Oberyn Martell, the younger brother to the ruler of Dorne, Prince Doran, leading a unit just called Oberyn Martell, although for the sake of clarity, I'll just call them his household guard. Oberyn is a fan-favourite character in both the books and the show, who has a dark reputation for being a very dangerous warrior who is rumoured to use poison weapons to kill his foes. A brave warrior, he dies fighting the knight known as the Mountain, Gregor Clegane, in a trial by combat, the Mountain having slaughtered his sister's family decades before, although his poisoned spear ends up bringing down his foe, more than earning him his title of the Red Viper. Looking at his troops, they're well-armoured horsemen riding unarmoured steeds, all to a man wearing salays with partial gilding, showing off their elevated status as the guards to a lord, the salays looking straight out of the 15th century, covering their faces with veils to protect from what I'm assuming are the sands of their home deserts. Some in the unit have aventails attached to the sides of their salays for added protection, while others just wear padded coifs it seems, their torsos being protected by arming doublays or gambeson, over which they have a mix of scale and lamellar armour shirts. Such armour saw widespread use in antiquity as well as the Middle Ages, although not so much in Western Europe, being a common sight in Southern Europe and the Middle East, in service by peoples such as the Ayyubids, the Moors, and the Byzantine Empire. These troops with their mix of Eastern body armour and Western helmets, being highly reminiscent of Byzantine troops at the very end of the Empire. Turning back to the armour, some of the men only have leather taruges in the style of the Romans and ancient Greeks to protect their shoulders, while others have scaled shoulders keeping their upper arms safe, many in the unit having mail sleeves for the rest of their arms, their hands having leather riding gloves for protection. Apart from their leather boots, the only other bit of protection these troops have are scale skirts or tarugis covering their upper legs, tarugis being leather and linen strips that protected the limbs and allowed flexibility at the same time, their look being topped off with scarlet cloaks. Turning to their shields and weapons, for defence every man has a round shield covered in metal, the rims of the shield being highly engraved and decorated, while the shield as a whole is emblazoned with the sun and spear heraldry of House Martell. Somewhat smaller shields like these make a lot of sense for heavy cavalry, as horsemen in general use smaller shields than infantry, these shields resembling the highly used and widely used round shields of the High Middle Ages, being somewhat similar to the large bucklers, the shields being somewhat domed to help reflect blows more easily. For weapons, at their side the men use a variety of swords, some looking like 12th century arming swords, while others resemble Turkish tillagers and Indian talwars with their curved blades. The main weapons, however, are their lances, some of which have pennants bearing the Martell sigil, the wicked long point of the weapon being perfect for running through foes. Overall, the unit has a timeless quality about it. The ancient armour styles mixing with medieval trends to make the unit that shows a lot of historical influences, yet isn't just a copy of one style of one time period, looking way better than the standard Dornish soldiers in Game of Thrones. If I have any criticism, it's that while Dorne isn't based off medieval Western Europe to the same degree the other Seven Kingdoms are, it still seems to take a lot of inspiration from that, given that a lot of knights from the region are described as wearing plate armour, more in line with the knights of the late Middle Ages than the cavalrymen of North Africa, so it would be nice to see that reflected more, although the Salets seem to be a concession to that idea. My criticisms aside, however, it might be that the motto intends to have some of the other Dornish houses added to the mod to be somewhat more Western in appearance, with the Martells being more unique in their aesthetic. Which, if so, would be pretty cool to see, and a nice way of showing that even within one kingdom, there's a lot of variation when it comes to arms and armour. Turning to the general, Oberyn himself, one of the first things that strikes me about him is that he has long hair, something mentioned in the books but absent from the show, which just shows the attention to detail the mod creators have. Beginning with his helmet, he wears a gilded sallet with a coronal above it, the helmet distinguishing him from his men, while his lamellars shirt also looks to be finer, the gilded vambraces and greaves on his forearms and shins also indicating his elevated status, given no one else has any. Finally, his weapon is unique too, wielding a spear shorter than the lances of his men, the spear having a hair tuft on it similar to those seen on Mongol spears and other pole weapons used by steppe peoples, the spear being his weapon of choice in universe, so it's cool to see it in use. As a unit, these guys are your archetypal heavy desert and steppe cavalry, not quite being as armoured as cataphracts but still packing a punch. A professional gold tier late game unit, I'd more than recommend these guys as general if you want to bring extra firepower to battle, although the other unit that can serve as general has more than enough firepower to be adequate. A very cool unit, and with Oberyn looked at, we'll move on to the next unit in the faction roster, the Desert Bowmen. Looking at their armour, some just wear gambeson, padded textile armour, while others have mail underneath their gambeson, contributing to their mail sleeves. Leather gloves occasionally seen used for hand protection, some of the men bearing the Martell sigil on their chest. Apart from their leather boots, the only other bit of armour they have is helmets. Norman-style conical helmets with aventails seeing use, as well as Ottoman turban-style helmets with attached cheek guards, although some men in the unit skip helmets and just have turbans for head protection. While I'd normally criticise troops for having body armour but lacking helmets is historically inaccurate. For archers who aren't meant to see frontline combat, it makes sense that some would skip the weight and discomfort of a helmet in place of a turban, which are known to be somewhat able to prevent sword slashes. For weapons, they have daggers for close combat, although their main weapons are the recurve bows they carry. Recurve bows being widely used historically by steppe people such as the Mongols and Huns, as well as the nomads of the desert such as the Bedouin. The weapon choice being a great one. Looking at the unit officer, he is beautifully equipped, wearing the same helmet as the previous unit with an attached aventail, but topped with the coronal and crest. His torso being covered with a mail shirt over which he has a beautiful scale hauberk. His arms being protected by vambraces, spolders, couters, and articulated plate gauntlets straight out of the 16th century, as are the gilded vambraces, sabatons, and pollens protecting his lower legs. Using the same shield seen before, the officer wields a talwar, his exquisite use of armour helping to allay my concerns about the units looking too far removed aesthetically from the other factions. As a unit, these guys are your cheap, early game bronze tier bowmen, very plentiful, who can deliver death from afar. Given that the Dornish rely heavily on skirmishers, these will see heavy use in Dornish armies, both due to being the only unit initially available which fulfills the ranged role, as well as the fact that they're cheap and easy to amass. Because they lack shields and heavy armour, it is important to note that they're not the best at getting into shootouts with enemy archers. Overall, a very cool unit that helps show off what you'd expect your average soldier to look like more or less, being conscripted peasants who have some modicum of equipment, rather than being ill-equipped hordes. Moving on, we come to the old palace servants who are equipped almost identically to the desert bowmen, except that some men have mail veils protecting their faces. That, and the fact that they use swords and shields instead of bows, using the same killages and talwars seen before. The shields these guys use is a bit different, being a flat wooden buckler rimmed with wood, a far more basic design than that of Oberyn's household guard, although some of these shields also have the Martell sigil. Skipping their officer, who's identical to the one we saw before, these guys are your basic melee infantry, being lightly armoured and equipped infantry, who are indicative of the regular rank and file, although it should be said, it'd be more realistic if the swords were mostly replaced by axes, given swords weren't that widely used by lesser infantry. An early game bronze tier infantry unit who were cheap and easy to amass. My only issue with them is really their name, as I'm not sure if these guys are meant to represent lightly armoured levies or quite literally armoured servants of House Martell. Maybe a name change is in order for these guys, or maybe I'm out of order. You guys let me know what you think in the comments. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Spear Recruits, who are the spear equivalent of the Old Palace servants, using the exact same armour and shields in conjunction with spears. Some that look somewhat African, having a bulbous base, while others are your standard leaf-shaped spear. The African style ones can be better for slashing as well as stabbing. Skipping the previously seen officer, as a unit these bronze tier spearmen will be the core of your early game armies, as well as a supporting unit for your more professional troops, these guys being the core of the Dornish war machine, as the Dornish men are well known for their proficiency and favour for spears. Overall, these guys will be key to repelling cavalry and giving your skirmishers space and time to tear apart enemy formations with volleys before your army goes on the offensive. A great unit to see, and one that doesn't have a confusing name, which is very much appreciated. Moving on, we come to the Golden Pikemen, the pike equivalent of the Spear Recruits. Armoured exactly the same, the thing that sets these men apart is the decision to drop shields and instead wield pikes. The pikes having the issue of having long heads, which is inaccurate given that pikes had as small a head as possible as to reduce weight and strain on the shaft. So the regular spearhead tip seen here is off. Skipping the ubiquitous officer, this unit is an odd one as well. The other units make sense being in Dorne's roster. Pikemen are never mentioned as being fielded by Dorne or House Martell, although perhaps pikes are included under spears when talking about the Dornish propensity for waging war in such a fashion. Best used as a block in the core of your army, flanked by your spearmen or swordsmen. These bronze tier pikes are good at grinding through early game formations and slaughtering horsemen, although care should be taken to clear the field of bowmen, as these guys are slaughtered by ranged infantry due to the lack of shields and armour. I wouldn't make the bulk of your army pikemen, but as an added bit of muscle, they certainly aren't bad. Moving on, we come to the Sunspear men-at-arms, who are definitely a step up when it comes to armour. Using the same mix of helmets and turbans as the previous units, these troops are arming blazing gambesson with taruges for the shoulders and crotch. Some having mailed sleeves or all wear leather cuirasses over the aforementioned blazing gambesson, the legs being unarmoured apart from boots and their hands occasionally having leather gloves for protection. Using the same shields and swords seen before and having the same officer seen before, these guys resemble Arab soldiers of the various Middle Eastern sultanates of the High Middle Ages. Serving the same role as the Old Palace servants, these guys are your mid-game silver tier lion swordsmen, more or less a match for equivalent units and a definite step up from starting infantry. Generally, I'd say these guys suit a support role for your forces, giving you some offensive infantry help relieve the pressure on your spearmen, being good in assaults on castles and other fortifications. My only issue with the unit is its name, as historically men-at-arms weren't regular infantry serving nobility, but instead were heavy cavalry of the late Middle Ages, who were equivalent to knights in battlefield roles, if not socially, many knights being men-at-arms. One thing to note though is that it's been a very extensive trend to refer to regular infantry as men-at-arms in both fantasy and historical books and TV shows, in spite of the inaccuracy, and A Song of Ice and Fire is no stranger to this flaw, so I can't blame the modders for giving their units names seen in the books, even if the names are inaccurate to real life. Moving on, we come to the Water Garden Guards, the Water Gardens being the holiday resort of House Martell. Looking at these warriors, they're well armoured, wearing a mix of conical helms, some with nasal bars and some without, all in the unit having male veils protecting their faces, the veils helping give the unit a Varangian guard aesthetic. Turning to the rest of their armour, they wear gambesson with a male skirt to protect their upper legs, over which they wear what I'm assuming is meant to be brigandine, some having taruges to protect their upper arms and crotch, while some have spolders, their hands having leather gloves and the lower legs long leather boots. At their sides they carry daggers and arming swords with beautifully patterned scabbards, the main weapon being nasty glaives that are excellent at hacking apart lightly armoured infantry and horses. The weapon choice being a nice nod to the books where the captain of the Martell household guard uses a glaive as his main weapon. Skipping their sword and shield wielding officer, these guys are mid-game silver tier shock infantry, great at breaking up enemy formations but not so good at holding gaps in lines, offense being their strongest defense. Against stuck cavalry, these guys are quite effective, however shock cavalry will tear them apart on the charge, while due to their lack of shields, they're weak to range attackers who can cut them down easily. Overall, a unit that's best used in the support role to take advantage of situations as they arise. Moving on to the next unit, we come to the sole ubiquitous artillery unit the faction possesses, Catapults. Looking very much like the torsion-powered catapults of antiquity, these weapons are crewed by lightly armoured men, all wearing conical helms or acorn-styled helmets, with their torsos being protected by gambesons, some having mail sleeves, some having aventails and coifs, and some having leather gloves, the swords at their sides being highly reminiscent of the Ottoman yataghan, a sword commonly seen in use by light infantry and supporting troops like these guys. As a unit, the catapults are generally a prerequisite to victory in sieges, especially as the attacker, as they allow you to punch holes in enemy fortifications rather than storming the walls and suffering higher casualties, although being very useful when on the defensive in killing clumped up enemies and enabling counterfire on enemy batteries. Overall, this unit is a must-have, although in open battlefields its effectiveness and critical need is limited. Moving on, the Sun Spear Sergeants make an appearance, who, wearing the same armour as the Sun Spear men-at-arms, are their spear equivalent, wielding the same basic round shield in conjunction with spears seen previously. Skipping their more heavily armoured officer, these mid-game silver tier spearmen are liable to make up the core of your mid-game army, and in universe are the bulk of the Dornish army given their affinity for spears. Generally a good unit to use to flank your pike blocks, who are not the best killers, can hold off cavalry and endure arrow storms very well, generally being a tough cookie. Going to the next unit, we come to the Desert Hunters, who are armoured much the same way as the other starter units, these men being differentiated by their use of the standard shield in combination with javelins, these men being lightly armoured skirmishers. Javelins were widely used both in antiquity and in the Middle Ages by warriors around the globe, though the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa were well known to field exceptional skirmishers who were valued for their skills and prized as mercenaries. Given Dawn's historical inspiration, it makes sense for them to have skirmishers in the mod, as does the fact that Dawn was known to field sizable amounts of skirmishers in-universe, such as during the first Blackfire Rebellion. Skipping the officer, these guys will give your early game armies range strength, though it should be noted they don't have the range of archers, so you have to get close to the enemy before being able to hit them. Well, this means these guys are liable to sustain casualties before engaging. They can guerrilla deploy ahead of your lines, meaning ambushes are very easy to pull off, and their stalk ability means they can remain hidden in any terrain, making them quite a hassle to deal with. I say try and keep them away from cavalry and infantry, given that they can't stand up to them in a fight, but apart from that they're a fantastic unit that I'd more than recommend including in even your late game armies, even if they are only an early game bronze tier unit. Moving on, the Riders of the Dune make an appearance. Riding unarmoured steeds, these men are armoured mostly the same as the Desert Hunters, with gambeson being their main form of protection in conjunction with acorn helmets, all in the unit having standard round shields slung over their backs, as are their lances, some of which look to be made of bamboo. Bamboo lances are being used by many cultures, including the British in the 19th century. The main weapon of the riders, however, are their recurve bows, which we've seen before. Skipping the officer, as a unit, these mid-game silver tier men act as light cavalry, who can pivot between hitting you with arrow fire before then charging into the gaps of your line with their lances, much like the Mongols, who use light lances and mounted archers to tear apart enemy armies. These guys are very much lethal when it comes to battle, though it should be noted that enemy range units and pikemen are best avoided, as are heavy enemy cavalry, who if they catch them, will beat this unit in a straight-up melee. Always try and maneuver them around the less armoured flanks of your enemy, where they can pour fire into their rears before charging in and causing maximum carnage. Overall, a unit that will see sustained use by the wise general as far as I'm concerned. Moving on, the next unit is a unique one, as it can also be fielded as a general for House Martell, that unit being the Blazing Sun Lancers. Riding unarmoured horses, the riders are fairly well equipped. Looking at their head protection, they wear a mix of bassinets, salets, Boschen-style helmets reminiscent of Alexander's companion cavalry, and tall conical helmets much like those worn by Russian troops in the 16th century, leather being attached to all these helmets for neck protection and face veils being worn by all. For their torsos, they have mail coats which extend down to their legs, over which some have scale, lamellar and brigantine cuirasses, all having tarugis covering their crotch and shoulders, while some have basic pauldrons on their shoulders, some using gauntlets to protect their forearms and hands, while others rely on leather gloves and boots to protect hands and lower legs. At their side, each man has a sword which we've seen before, their main weapons being lances used in conjunction with the gilded round shields we've seen previously. Skipping the standard officer, these silver tier mid-game horsemen are the heavy cavalry of House Martell, designed to break enemy horse and punch holes in formations. Not as heavily armoured as some of the other horsemen fielded by other factions who more resemble the heavy French cavalry of the 1500s compared to these men, who more look like lighter lances from southeastern Europe, such as the original hussars. These troops are still more than dangerous and can very easily be your battle winners, working well in conjunction with your hordes of spearmen and skirmishers. Overall, a pretty useful unit whose importance only skyrockets once you realise it can also serve you as a general, giving you a pretty strong general at a fair price. Moving on, we come to the final three units of the faction. The royal troops of House Martell, beginning with the royal swordsmen. Armoured identically to Oberyn's guard and wielding the same swords and shields as that unit, these men and their heavily armoured officer are a late game gold tier unit. The most elite swordsmen the faction can field who in sieges can be perfect at the spear tip of your forces when attacking, or as a reserve when defending, open battlefields too being their forte, as they can mow down enemy infantry so long as they're kept safe from heavy cavalry and sustained archer fire. Moving to their spear equivalent, the royal spearmen in their gilded armour stand tall, using spears and shields previously seen. A more defensive unit than the previous one, these guys are great as a bulwark in battle, especially when defending in a siege as they can hold the line almost indefinitely, their shields making them more resistant to ranged attack than the next unit. That unit would be the royal pikemen, who as their name suggests are their pike counterparts. In a change that's very nice to see, these men use their shields slung over their left shoulders, much like the pelter shields used by Alexander the Great's phalangites. An indomitable formation of troops, these guys are best kept as a reserve in sieges to hold choke points, or in the front line of your army in open battles where they can be a mobile bastion for your army, waves of enemies breaking on them. Overall, I'd use all three of these units as your reserves to bolster your army. Your choice of unit depending on the circumstances, though if you can amass more than enough of them to be the core of your army, and more than make their presence known. A very cool trio of unit, all things considered. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Martell of Dorne are a faction who very much rely on their spears and skirmishers to carry the day, much as they do in the books. That said, while the faction does have its main focus, it does have variety, meaning it's not solely restricted to one type of strategy, horse archer hordes being just as valid as pike blocks. I'd say that compared to some of the more straightforward and basic factions and houses, these guys require you to use your brain a bit more to make up for their relative weakness when it comes to heavy infantry and cavalry, making them all the more unique and interesting to play. Overall, a very unique faction that has a very unique appearance, helping to set them apart from all potential foes. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured, more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.